Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mastering Sustainable Corporate Travel, Breaking Barriers and Leading the Charge. I'm Kelly Mingle, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping items to review. The first is the live poll we have open right now. If you would take a moment to answer the questions, it will help us gauge everyone's goals and level of interest for future webinars. As for today's webinar, it will last 60 minutes, which includes time at the end for questions. Please use the Q&A window in the Zoom toolbar to submit your questions at any point. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. With us today, we have Joel Hanson. Joel is an esteemed figure in the travel industry and holds an impressive role as a startup advisor and mentor. He champions regenerative business travel and advocates for utilizing the industry to tackle climate change by drawing from his past contributions, advancing the travel industry as head of innovation business development for CWT. Beyond his professional achievements, Joel is a devoted father who recently embarked in a unique Halloween costume. Him and his wife were actually both dressed up as hydrogen, and his son Benjamin dressed up as oxygen. So together they were H2O. As he joins us today, Joel brings not only a wealth of knowledge, but a passion for making a difference in how we approach business travel. Next, we have Scott Gillespie. Scott's interest in sustainable travel started as a boy. At 14 years old, he flew alone at 10,000 feet over the Arizona desert without an engine. It was his first solo flight in a glider and the greenest flight he has ever taken. Today, Scott is widely known for his provocative thought leadership in the business travel industry. He paved the way for modern airline emissions modeling, cracked the code on travel's ROI, and is the champion of justifiable travel and invisible carbon budgeting. Scott welcomes new connections on LinkedIn, where he regularly shares his latest thinking. And lastly, we have Philip Charm, the co-founder and chief business officer at Climate Club, who, since a young age, has found deeper sleep on airplanes than in his own bed. Alongside being a dedicated husband and father of two young boys, Philip has built an extensive career in scaling go-to-market organizations for various enterprise software companies. His Climate Club story began a summer evening in his backyard with his former college roommate and now co-founder, Adam Braun, as they watched their kids play. Together, and with the rest of the Climate Club team, they are on a mission to help organizations turn climate intention into action. Thank you all for joining us today. Phil, I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks everyone for joining. I actually really like Joel's costume idea. I think that's something I'm going to have to take. On a personal note, travel for me is an incredibly important part of my professional career story. Early on, I was mentored by someone who gave me the opportunity to travel the world with him and serve some of the largest, most complex organizations. And it completely changed my trajectory as a person and as a professional. And so it's one of the reasons why I'm personally so passionate about helping organizations develop a scalable and sustainable approach to travel, because I know the impact it can have. I think we'd all agree that we're at an inflection point when it comes to sustainability generally and decarbonization specifically. Over 9,000 organizations thus far have made some sort of sustainability commitment. Upwards of 3,500 companies have set science-based targets, yet according to Accenture, 93% of companies will miss their target unless they accelerate their progress on reduction. And in parallel, we're seeing the first real wave of regulatory frameworks being adopted across the globe for both reporting, but also through emissions reduction. So whether that's CSRD in Europe, SB 253 in California, any SEC impending legislation, and then increasing legislation and expectations in the UK, Singapore, Australia, et cetera, it's no surprise that executive teams across the world are starting to take net zero and decarbonization seriously. And they're thinking about how to apply more traditional methods for driving change and transformation in their organizations. I think for this audience particularly, it won't be a surprise that for technology companies, services companies, healthcare, pharmaceutical companies, financial services organizations, business travel is really playing an outsized role in leading that sustainability transformation. And it's for all the reasons we've seen and experienced historically. It's visible, it's variable, it impacts large percents of the organization and has a huge impact on culture. And I think we're often seeing now, more importantly, that it's one of the areas where you can really tie near-term ROI to decarbonization and sustainability initiatives. This, for me, came to a head at the Verge conference, which is a sustainability conference that was held in California in October, where generally sustainability teams identified air travel as their number one most common problem that they were focused on going forward. Actually, a far cry than what had been just even 24 months ago. But today, there really isn't a playbook for how to successfully execute decarbonization in travel. Lots of companies are trying, but no one has the full answer. And so today, I'm really excited to have Joel and Scott and I share with you recommendations that we've learned from dozens of interviews with leading companies and peoples in many different roles and functions, from sustainability and travel to procurement to sales and other roles. So I hope you enjoy it and find practical opportunities to be able to take action, not just in the future, but in the near term. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joel.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Phil. And I have to just say how wonderful it is to be with this group today. I think you could probably be hard pressed to find a more caring group of webinar attendees in the world. So it's fantastic to be with you all today. Maybe you remember where you were when you first heard the term, the 4 Ps of marketing. Maybe you were in college or maybe you were in an MBA program. But in any case, we want to introduce you to a new set of 4 that hopefully will be as impactful for your career as those may have been. This is the 4 pillars to decarbonize a business travel program. And you are literally like the first people in the world seeing these pillars. I think they're soon going to become, if I may say, kind of a foundational standard that will be a reference point throughout the industry. Leadership and alignment is the first pillar. Then we move into goals and balance, moving through reporting and results, and finally, and in this order, constraints and enablers. So that's at a big picture. Those are the 4 pillars that I'll spend a few minutes today kind of talking through. And as Phil alluded to, Scott and I had a chance to talk to a lot of your peers around the world. And so the insights that I'm about to share, some of them, yes, they are indeed my opinion, but they're also deeply, deeply informed by the perspective of the very folks that we spoke to who should represent, hopefully, perspectives that you may recognize as being even your own. So next slide, please. So the first pillar up, and I have to admit, I really am quite passionate about this particular pillar. If ever in the universe there was a topic in corporate America that requires leadership and really stepping up to the plate and orchestrating change, sustainability is it. If you think about your company, if you had a major new competitor, just a garden variety new competitive entrant, you might have like a half-day offsite to discuss what does that mean, what are the implications, what should we do about it. And yet with this topic that is literally transforming the world under our feet and before our very eyes, some companies are choosing to kind of put their head in the sand and not necessarily fully grapple with the implications of this sea change that we're going through. So I really think, like I say, if ever there was a topic where it needs orchestrated leadership, frankly, from the top and all throughout the organization, this is that topic. And we do see quite a wide disparity between organizations in their approach to this. On one end of the spectrum, you've got folks where the CEO herself or himself leads the charge. They make this core to the business. They decree that sustainability is heart and center of their path going forward. And we actually heard of a company where they kind of decreed that 2030 isn't a future date that we can just keep kicking that can down the road. They sort of said, 2030 for us is last year. We've got to get our arms around this now. And I think, in a way, if I can opine, that's probably the right attitude to have about it. On the far other side of the spectrum, we see some firms that are frankly not all that impressive about it. They put it with maybe the comms team as though it's a simple PR exercise, or maybe they put it with legal as though it's a simple regulatory check the box. And I think what we heard from your peers is that sustainability leaders, and frankly, probably the better they are, the more likely they are to be attuned to what are the signaling effects of where sustainability is placed within the organization. And our view is that this is, if ever there was a topic that warranted top management's attention and involvement, this is certainly it. So the change here, being vast, requires enterprise-wide orchestration and orchestrated change. And there are a couple aspects of that. One is sort of what I would call like the software between our ears, how we collaborate, how we speak, how we listen. Do we speak the same language about sustainability and about business? But there's also kind of a what I'll call a hard and crunchy aspect to it that's almost more like an operating system. And if you think about a company today, they have many, many different operating systems in place, whether technical or financial or in terms of governance. But related to sustainability, my observation, and I think our findings, is that the sustainability operating system, if you will, of a company today is comparatively quite weak and immature. And we actually had somebody that we spoke to who had joined the airline industry and made a kind of, as a new entrant to that industry, she observed, wow, these people have an SOP for everything, but I'm not really hearing much about an SOP for sustainability, as like a missing part of their playbook. And so we really do think that this is going to need to be an orchestrated journey, and that senior management will probably need to really lean into this challenge. So Phil, anything you want to add on that pillar?
I guess the word I would use here is empathy, which is we need to sit in each other's shoes and collaborate, right? Not one function or not one team is able to actually execute. And so understanding sustainability and its business partners and how everyone sits is really important. I've had the opportunity to work with hundreds of sustainability leaders over the last couple of years, and I would summarize their role in sort of two ways. One is translation. So, how do I translate sustainability into the language of my potential business partners? And the second is sales. How do I sell you on the idea that I need you to partner with me? And so sustainability teams often spend their time begging for help or trying to align and collaborate. And this is where we see just a tremendous opportunity for the partnership between travel and sustainability, where travel and sustainability are really ideal partners for collaboration, as there's a shared set of goals, not just around sustainability, but sustainability goals and decarbonization goals really do align well with the common priorities that travel teams and procurement teams are being asked to think about around cost reduction and productivity. And so there's a great opportunity to really try to have empathy for one another and come to the other to share and learn and understand about their goals, and then work together for developing a business case to get alignment with executives for success. And so that shared opportunity between a procurement team and a travel team and a sustainability team to develop a case for the CFO, for the chief procurement officer, which shows that decarbonization has near-term ROI and productivity, is really powerful. And I think every sustainability team is looking for a partner to do that. And most importantly, I think from a marketing and strategic brand perspective, every organization is looking for an opportunity to show wins in the supply chain and how do we engage our suppliers and also decarbonize our supply chain. And given where most travel organizations sit, there's a natural opportunity to leverage the impact of a really successful sustainable travel program to begin on that journey and accelerate the path to decarbonizing the supply chain.
Love it. Thanks, Phil. Yeah. So pillar number 2 is really all about balance and balancing our carbon reduction goals with business objectives. And I think empathy absolutely comes into play here as we try to understand those two and understand each other. One thing we see is that there's a view sometimes that sustainability is somehow additive, that it's like a new topic that sits on top of the business as though it's somehow to the side of the business. And our view, and what we heard from the folks we talked to, is that probably a better view and a more accurate view is that sustainability is part and parcel of the business itself. It's within the fabric of how you operate as a business. And we sometimes see sustainability leaders maybe have the view that businesses occasionally pursue profit almost myopically to the exclusion of other considerations that are very important, like sustainability. And fair enough. And what we would just observe is that the myopic pursuit of sustainability, absent all of their dimensions, is also not likely to be a very effective path. And so you really want to kind of marry these two considerations of business effectiveness and sustainability into one path that makes sense holistically for your organization. You may know the name Sadhguru. He's rather renowned these days. He was recently interviewed at the United Nations, And he made a comment on this subject that kind of stayed with me. He said economy and ecology must go hand in hand. So I thought that was a pretty succinct way to get across the idea that, the economic benefits aren't the enemy of sustainability. They're part of how you'll get to that goal that you care about. What we heard as we spoke to folks over and over was how important it is to stay in balance. And to give you a flavor of imbalance, we spoke with a consulting firm, and they made an interesting decision. Their business model is heavily dependent on mentorship of the sort of the next generation of consultants. And even though that's the case, they made the decision to eliminate 100% of internal travel cut. That's we're going to have none of that internal travel, and maybe predictably or maybe not, but in fact morale did nosedive. They started to lose talent, and even some leadership who had been supportive of that decision left the company. And so we really think it's key to consider the implications of the actions that you take on really any subject, but certainly sustainability being no exception. And we would just observe that balance kind of cuts both ways. It's possible to be kind of over your skis in reducing carbon to the exclusion of all other considerations, but it's also equally possible to vastly underestimate the magnitude of change needed and just sort of put blinders on and say we're going to travel reflexively as per usual. And either approach would probably be a case of imbalance. I would say in general, it's really just a good idea to recognize the connected nature of a business, keep a holistic view in mind. And essentially what we need to do here is orchestrate change while staying in balance. So Phil, over to you for anything to add there.
Yeah, I'd say the common thing and common mistake or challenge that we see organizations face is when they make and set science-based targets, particularly interim targets around 2030, without connecting those targets to the business goals and strategy. And it's really hard to drive sustained, operationally driven decarbonization when you're treating the carbon reduction planning process as a completely independent thing from the same rigorous business planning process. As Scott and Joel has mentioned, there's a real connective tissue between them. And so thinking about what are the levers that I can pull, what are the implications on the business, and how do I make sure that these goals are shared and in alignment is a critical part of the process. And the most common thing that the kind of leading organizations are doing is they're scenario planning, they're modeling, they're thinking about trade-offs, and they're recognizing that business environments are dynamic. And so therefore need to think about our carbon planning process as dynamic as well. The changes from one quarter to another really impact the way we need to think about our strategies, approaches, execution, and goals within the context of both our business process and our decarbonization process.
Well, thanks, Phil. And next up is pillar 3, which is all about valuable data and reporting related to both carbon and the business goals that travel enables, and using that to guide the ship forward. We often find that folks are starting at data and getting into sort of like a minor data dust up or argument about a particular methodology. And we think that's partly a function of maybe having skipped some of the foundational steps of aligning on view, what's our strategic intent. And so if you find yourself in sort of endless data debates, lacking a broader context, it might be a sign that you've put the cart a little bit before the horse. So just a comment there. But that said, data is absolutely, without question, very foundational here, and really does often serve as the catalyst. There's often a need that arises for some reporting or some data, and it causes people, even firms that maybe aren't leaning into this subject, find themselves of necessity having the conversation because the data has required it. That's especially true for public companies. We're seeing a pretty big trend of executive compensation increasingly being tied to ESG metrics, which in my view is a very positive development. What that means, though, is that the scrutiny on the data is going to go through the roof. For public companies, these things become publishable to very important bodies, whether the SEC here in the United States, or as part of the CSRD in Europe, or as part of the CDP Climate Disclosure Project. There are a lot of, I guess I'll say, teeth in a way, in terms of there's a need to feed some data into these groups that let's just say they're not kidding around and wanting to look at that data. And so the foundation does need to be strong, and it's probably something that'll only intensify over the coming years. Alongside the reporting requirements, we also see companies really just embracing the idea that, hey, maybe it's time for our own reasons to kind of turn the lights on and not travel in the dark. And so I think what you'll see more and more of is companies having enterprise-wide dashboards that show what kind of carbon emissions we're seeing at a business unit level or even at the individual traveler level. So I think the days of, yeah, there's travel happening, but who knows, what the carbon impact of that is going to be a thing of the past quite quickly here. One thing to keep in mind is that as you go on this journey, it's possible for there to be genuine tensions that can arise between fiduciary responsibilities and broader corporate responsibilities. And you may experience or notice misalignment. Maybe there's some aspect that's become out of alignment despite the attempt to stay in balance. And so we actually met folks who spoke to that they had actually experienced that. And a quote that really stood out to Scott and to me was someone who said, we really over rotated. We cut travel too much. And so as you go through this journey, I would say don't think of it as set it and forget it. This is something where you've got to keep your eye on the ball and sort of see, are we staying in balance? Are we over rotated? And just keep your eye on that. Phil, anything you'd add on this pillar?
Yeah, if the first problem or challenge that organizations face is not aligning their decarbonization broader goals with their business goals, the second problem is confusing the types of reporting and tools necessary for historical looking reporting and compliance with managing to a decarbonization target. The data, the systems, the insights necessary to keep things in balance, as Joel mentioned, are fundamentally different. The example that I've often heard is like, you'd never give a sales team a dashboard that showed them their historical 6-month performance and then expect them to be able to hit their next quarter's targets or their 6 months targets. It's a very similar thing with product, service, support, operations organizations. Teams really need to be, if they're going to be held accountable to achieving goals, they need the tools to help them manage towards those targets with the relevant insights and learnings from the last action so they can take better action next in order to continue to make progress towards both their business objectives and their sustainability or decarbonization objectives. And if they're given one for the business tools and the business goals, but don't have the other for the sustainability or the carbon goals, they're much more likely to align towards that one.
Well, thanks, Phil. And look how time flies. We are already at pillar number 4. So I'll just say here that a lot of times people start here, but really it's the 4th step of the process. So looking at applying carbon-oriented constraints and enablers to move the needle in ways that are appropriate for your business. And what we observe here, and this again was such a resounding theme in our research, is that companies have made very bold public commitments, but they don't necessarily know how to fulfill those commitments. And there's a huge gap there and maybe a huge opportunity for someone and for anyone who is able to bridge that gap between intention and action and bring to fruition what has been publicly proclaimed. And so we find that a key enabler here is actually attitudinal. Maybe surprisingly, you'd maybe think, what tool do I need? But maybe the first tool is attitudinal. And the attitude we would recommend and that we heard your peers recommend is one of exploratory leadership. Don't assume that either you have all the answers or that the people you're talking to have all the answers. We were often told that an attitude of exploration and discovery is very appropriate, especially in the early innings here. And it's been the finding of some of the sustainability leaders we talked to that among travel managers, people who are explicitly focused on travel, there was a view that probably only about 10% of them truly know enough about sustainability at this time. And so expect a certain amount of education required. There'll be sustainability folks getting up to speed on travel and the converse. So just be aware of that. But even when there's an attitude of exploration, a lot of times people do run into challenges with the constraint of budgets. That seems to be a major sticking point that arises. And even when a company has made sort of a symbolic investment in SAF, which is a fairly common maneuver, hey, we're totally on board, we're supporting SAF, we wrote a check. it was symbolic in nature. And oh, by the way, if you ask the follow-up question, okay, cool. After the initial symbolic check, did they establish an annual budget? Did they decide where that budget resides? And then there's sort of crickets as you wait for that response. And so, gestures are one thing, but long-term commitments are another. So we think that as an example, the what I just raised about SAF is probably kind of typical of today's reality on this topic, where the business is over here and sustainability is a bit over there, and they're not fully married up. And our view after talking to a lot of your peers is that it just won't stay that way. It just won't. And so when we asked your peers, in a few years' time, how do you see this unfolding? 100% of them felt that in not long from now, sustainability will be woven into every aspect of business. And so this idea of a cherry on top is not going to hold. And so we do find in terms of enablers that a lot of folks are looking at certain practical approaches like carbon budgets. Scott and I are relatively bullish on carbon budgets and think those definitely have a place. One idea that we're hearing quite a bit about as well is carbon taxes. And I would say Scott and I are probably less keen there, probably have some, questions about whether that's really going to be the right approach longer term. But the point is that every one of your peers is actively considering these things. What does the next step look like, and how do we begin to move the needle? Phil, anything you would add there?
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is generally cross-functional stakeholders that we see travel, procurement, sustainability, finance are generally aware of some of the basic levers at their disposal to take action. And Scott's going to talk in detail about that relatively soon. But the question that often comes up is we don't necessarily have the resources to do everything at once. And not all the actions are going to have the same value or impact across an organization. And so the fundamental question is, which ones do we choose? How do we sequence them? And where do we deploy them? And so this is where we're seeing leading organizations really look to evaluate, assess, model opportunities and scenarios, think about sequencing as part of their strategic plan so they can prioritize initiatives by the appropriate criteria. So an example you'll find is we want to start in the US this year. We're going to focus on Europe next year, or we're going to focus on internal travel this year. We're going to focus on client travel in the services industry next year, and thinking about the different levers and approaches and strategies that you can use to deploy over a period of time, given finite resources and focus, is going to consistently be more and more important in service of sustained goal and progress against a 2030 or nearer term target.
Well, thanks, Phil. And I love that word sequencing that Phil just used, and I think it is a decent prelude into this overview here. The point we want to make here is that these pillars that we just walked through, they're not separate entities. They're deeply, deeply intertwined. And since we're talking to a group of people today where by definition, if you're here, you care about the interrelationship between things, between people and environment, and how one thing affects another, apply that same mindset of interdependence and interbeing and sort of holistic thinking as you think about these very pillars that we just walked through. Leadership and alignment is incredibly foundational. It then dovetails very naturally into what kind of goals do we want to set and how do we stay in balance. And then reporting and results is kind of the reality check against that, and then the constraints and enablers to move the needle. But the point we're trying to make with this slide is that these things are all in interaction all the time. And so, your task as a sustainability leader or travel leader or both is to really try to hold the center and be kind of that anchor within your company that is really holding the center on these topics and moving it forward in an orchestrated fashion. So with that, I will hand it over to my illustrious colleague, Scott.
Thanks, Joel. I think both you and Phil have shared some really rich, well-informed views on the organizational implications of tackling this problem. What I'd like to take our audience through now are some maybe a little bit more specific approaches to building what I think is the goal. And the goal in my mind, I think all of our minds, we would say, is building a strategically sustainable travel program. An emphasis on strategic here, because that really, I think, really does justice to what Joel and Phil have talked about, the need to have a really holistic, senior management led, fully aligned and business appropriate approach to reducing carbon. So I'm going to share 4 markers of what I think this strategically sustainable travel program needs to have, needs to look like, these attributes. They're not the only ones, but I think they're a good place to start. So, give it a look, give it a listen, see what you think. The first step that you have to start with is this one. We have to think about the value. We have to recognize the value of linking every business trip to a business goal. And if we do that, which we can, it's a simple ask of all our travelers out there, just which business goal does this trip most directly support? You will soon be able to get a picture that looks like this. And I think that if you just stopped here and took this information from a quarter's worth of your business travel program efforts to your senior management, they would smile. They'd be, grinning from ear to ear. For the first time, they've got a really good insight in terms of how travel is helping enable the important business goals. So you have to start with this, but we can do better. What we need to do next is constantly challenge the value that travel is bringing to the organization. In a really sustainable mindset, you do not want to waste resources. You don't want to waste carbon on the wrong things. It's surprisingly easy to calculate the ROI from any business trip at any point in time. We've got a white paper on that. We'll share the link with you as part of the follow-up to this. It's easy to do. You can do it. You should do it, because senior management needs to understand where are they getting the most value from travel and where are they not. The inverse of this is the third marker. You have to have good visibility of low-value trips. And hey, we're all going to take some low-value trips, not intentionally, I hope, but it turns out that way, and that's fine. You just do not want to be spending, 35, 40, 45% of your travel budget on low-value trips, right? That's just a terrible waste. So you need to have really good visibility of trips and their value. And we can do this. Again, it's not hard. It's really simple. The fourth marker of a strategically sustainable travel program, no surprise, it's the extent to which we're using our carbon in a judicious, thoughtful, strategically appropriate, and wise approach. And so you're going to need some reference to what that means. And as Joel said, we're pretty bullish on the idea of carbon budgets. That makes a lot of sense. And once you establish a budget, with the right thought, then you can gauge whether or not you're spending that budget appropriately. And in some cases, you may want to overinvest in carbon, but you probably have to offset that somewhere else by, underinvesting in some other ones. So the point of this slide here is that you can quickly, I think, grasp the markers of a strategically sustainable travel program, and you should be able to take this to senior management and simply say, hey, what do you think? Should we be going in this direction? Let me go a little bit deeper here. I want to talk about 3 priorities for decarbonizing a sustainable travel program. And I think we'll all agree on this first one, and it's this. You have to absolutely reduce the absolute amount of carbon in a travel program. How you get there is, up for debate and for scientists and engineers to figure out to a large extent, but we can influence it. One of the best ways that we can influence it is this, and it may not be intuitive, but if you're going to ask an organization to reduce the amount of travel they're doing, you should be willing, you should expect to help them recognize or achieve a higher return on their remaining spend, right? So yes, we can probably cut out some travel, but we need to give the value back by helping the organization increase the ROI when they do travel, and we can do that. The third priority here is reducing the intensity, the carbon intensity of the remaining travel spend. And I'm going to go into more detail on that because to a large extent, that's the key to successfully building a strategically sustainable travel program. Let's start with this. What you see here are some different industry groups, and the metric that we're using is grams of kilogram per $100 of revenue. And what you see in the center of this slide is that it looks like, on average, the US GDP emits 24 grams of CO2 for every $100 of revenue that the economy produces. So that's, if you want a single benchmark, a frame of reference, it's probably that. Let's take a look at the airline industry, though, to see where they stand. No surprise, they are a much more intensive, carbon intensive initiative. They've just got a carbon intensive business model. They've got to spend a lot of fuel to move people around. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. Why is this important? Because as a corporate travel program steward, you need to be very aware of what your carbon intensity is on the airfares that you buy. And here's what that looks like, right? Take a look at this very illustrative example. You've got a $500 ticket. Presume it's going to be associated with 500 kilograms of CO2. That gives us this ratio of 100 kilograms of CO2 per $100 of airfare. So fine, we should agree that we need to drive that number down, right? Less would be better. Ideal would be zero kilograms for whatever we spend on airfare. You can do this at the ticket level, and you can roll this up to the entire air spend for your program. So all the companies out there, if you haven't done this, you easily could. You should do this. And the key point I want to make, I just want to really drive this home, is that both the buyers out there and our airline colleagues should agree that we want to drive the intensity of the air spend down. We want to make that ratio smaller. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what some business fares look like. Go back to this chart here. I'm going to show you the two types of fares, an economy type of fare and a business class type of fare, and you'll see where they stand in this ranking. This may surprise you, but those two types of fares, using these typical average carbon intensities that we found, are almost always going to be lower than the US airline average because they cost more. They're more expensive tickets. Everything else being equal, with a higher cost in that denominator, you're going to get a lower carbon intensity. What should be surprising and a little alarming to us is this. When you buy really cheap fares, like the basic economy fares out there, those are really dirty in terms of carbon, high intensity, high carbon intensities. So if you're trying to choose what type of airfare to buy, you want to be very aware of its carbon intensity. So that brings us to this. When we think about the audience out there, many of you are in sustainability, many of you are in corporate travel management. Probably none of you are aerospace engineers or chemists or hydrogen scientists. So the fact is, changing that numerator, the 500 kilograms of carbon, is not really within your wheelhouse, right? In fact, that's a physics problem. It's a chemistry problem. You're not going to be able to change that. You've got to trust other people to work on that, and that's going to be a slow walk to get there. What we can change collectively from a business perspective is the denominator. We can choose how much to pay for a ticket. And that's really important because if we focus on this denominator, which is the one that's the biggest lever we have, and if we accept higher prices and buy higher quality trips, we can actually reduce carbon emissions and several other benefits. Here's my contention. If you'll just focus on increasing the price paid, if you'll accept that as a premise, that that's actually a worthwhile and strategically valid approach, you will shrink the carbon intensity of your air spend. You will achieve that goal, just simple math there, right? Everything else being equal. The benefits, my contention, and I think many of you would agree, you will reduce carbon emissions. You'll get fewer trips, particularly low value trips, because you're going to be buying higher quality trips. You're going to decrease your traveler friction. That's got good benefits in and of itself. And you will increase the ROI on the remaining travel spend. All good things come from this approach. It's counterintuitive to many of you. I understand that, but just take a think, all right? Think about this way. And I think you may be inspired to open your mind to this approach. I've long contended for the last probably year and a half that corporate travel policies are not doing the right thing in terms of the climate impact. I'm going to try to make my case here, so bear with me. Let's assume that you've got a $10 million spend. And the typical company policy is the one that you see on the screen here. Book 14 days in advance, try to keep the price low, and definitely fly an economy because the economy cabin is the best one for the climate. If you did that, in this simple example, on a $10 million spend, you could expect about 9,200 metric tons of CO2. Okay? And you may think that's really good. We're doing the right thing for the business. But if we change the travel policy simply by letting people book closer to departure, which typically involves more expensive tickets, but stay in the economy cabin, we're going to reduce that emission significantly. Why? Because you're buying more expensive tickets. And that means you're going to have lower intensity, fewer trips, and therefore lower emissions. This is the point. It's the intensity that matters. It's not the cabin. You have to keep your eye on the intensity of your spend. So if you want to shift everybody into premium economy, hey, you're going to pay more. Your higher prices are going to happen, right? But you're going to reduce your intensity even more. You'll take fewer trips because they're more expensive. You can't squeeze that many trips out of your budget now, but you will have fewer emissions. And this just holds as far down the chain as you want to go. Again, I stress the point. It's the carbon intensity that matters, not the cabin. And an all economy cabin policy is not the best one for the climate. Yeah. All right. So if we're going to cut trips, if we're going to accept that we're going to pay more for trips and we're going to reduce the number of trips that we can afford in our budget, then where do we want to start? Well, it should be clear that you want to start with your low value trips. You want to eliminate those first. Turns out that's a great opportunity. And the research that we've done at TCLAR, and again, it's in the white paper that we'll make available to you, shows that about 25 to 30% of all business trips are indeed low value. That's what travelers will say if you ask them the right questions, which we've done, right, on over 400 business trips. So we have a pretty good idea that there's a nice opportunity to reduce travel by that much, and it won't harm the business. Think about it this way. When you think about if you really understand the value of the business trip, you should expect that the ROI on these business trips will increase the higher up this ladder you go. So should be the amount of money that you can justify to purchase a ticket or a hotel or the entire trip, right? A more important, a higher value trip can justify a higher price being paid for that trip. You can do the same thing for the cabin. Low value trips can't justify anything other than flying in economy, but the high value trips can definitely justify flying in business class, which, by the way, as you may have seen, have the lowest carbon intensity. The key here is that if you're going to accept higher prices, what's going to happen to the value of the travel that you're generating? Well, it's actually pretty productive. It turns out, as you can imagine, that higher prices are going to weed out low value trips just by the nature of managers being stingy and saying, no, you can't go on that, that little trip to go meet your buddy in the other department that you haven't seen for 2 months to talk about next quarter's, branding opportunity. No, you can do that by Zoom. If travel gets really expensive, what you're going to be left with are high value trips at the top of this chart. Those are going to have high returns, and that means they can justify the expensive airfares and definitely can justify flying in the most climate friendly cabin, which typically is going to be business class or first domestically. Okay, couple of points, couple of slides left here, and then we'll get to Q&A. I know a lot of you from our research have gone through steps like this in terms of starting by simply cutting travel budgets because that's an immediate effective way to reduce travel. Yes, but it's also probably the least thoughtful and the least strategically valuable way to reduce travel emissions. So not a fan of that one. Adding carbon taxes, yes, some people are doing that. This one's a little bit more mixed. It has some benefits, but I think it's got larger offsetting negatives. Happy to go into more detail on that if we have time. But I'm not a fan of either of these. Where I think we need to start is this place here. And that's simply asking the traveler to take a very simple pre-trip assessment, declare the goal that is most closely aligned with their trip. So you've got that foundational piece there. And start with this. It's remarkably simple, it's lightweight, and our research does show that senior management is actually very supportive of making this type of request of their travelers. Secondly, change your cabin policy. Go back and get people to think in a different way, a more constructive way, about the merits of letting people travel in a better cabin. It's really not about the cabin. What it really is the carbon intensity, and that takes us to the third step. Probably the most difficult, and as Phil mentioned, this does require modeling. It takes a lot of thought. You have to be intentional about how you approach what the right balance should be, but you will need to eventually set your goals in terms of a carbon budget or a carbon cap and the corresponding intensity that you're going to tolerate. Okay, we've said a lot. I'm going to leave you with two quick steps that I think many of you can take. I would start with this for many of you because you probably have this data or you know you're going to need this data. But as you can tell, the carbon intensity issue is really central to your approach to building a strategically sustainable travel program. So go find what your carbon intensities are. Your travel management company should be able to help you with this. If not, there are plenty of consulting firms out there. The point is you can get this information quickly. You'll need to do it because you're going to want to know what your starting point is, and you're probably going to want to do some benchmarking. Great, off you go. This other step is actually quicker, easier, and maybe even more productive in terms of getting traction with senior management. Take this simple chart and go shop it around your senior management team. Simply put it in front of them and ask them the question, do you think that we as an organization could manage our entire travel program much more strategically within our sustainable goals if we had this type of information? And I think what you'd get is those people would be leaning over their desk and asking you, how quick can we get this data? And the answer is relatively quick. So a lot of optimism in my mind for going in this direction. So two good takeaways right there. Let me leave you with this. If indeed this kind of inspires you to aspire to reaching this sort of a framework, if there's something here that you think has got merit, we're here to help. We'd be delighted to give you a 45-minute complimentary consultation. We've got a business travel carbon maturity model assessment that would ask you to take beforehand, a little prep work, and then we'll meet with you and review your maturity stage and certainly give you some insights in terms of reporting goals and the implications. So I know it's been a lot of information to consume. Yes, you will get a copy of this recording. And now I think I can turn it over to Phil to help us deal with some of the questions, or Kelly, if you've spotted some in the chat, let us know where you want us to start.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, we've got a series of questions coming through. I'll start at the beginning and direct them, I think, to appropriate audience. So question one, and I'll turn this over to you, Scott or Joel, is as business travel industry tries to decarbonize, how do you feel about oil companies sponsoring sustainability events at business travel conferences?
Sure, I'll take that first. I'm all in favor of it if they're doing it with the purest of intentions.
I would echo that. I think we have to applaud even small steps in the right direction. And I guess I'd rather see such a producer leaning into these types of topics. And I guess to Scott's point, there could be something purely optics oriented about it, which I would tend to look a little bit askance on. But at the same time, I think what it signals is that this is a topic whose time has come. And I think if we make an assumption that a traditional energy company isn't interested in the transformation of energy, that is a very silly assumption. They're probably more interested than we could imagine because their very business is at stake. And so, yeah, I guess I would just encourage all of us to be encouraging of even the smallest actions in the right direction and try to build from there.
Great. Thank you both. Second question, and this, Scott, goes to you. Who defines what makes a trip low value versus high value?
The traveler does, by and large. In the white paper that we'll share with you, we've used 4 criteria that we ask the traveler to rate both before, actually after they come back from the trip, to do the post-trip evaluation. It deals with the importance of the trip, how successful the trip was, what type of ROI did you get? And again, I testify that you can calculate ROI on a trip very easily. And then the substitutability or the virtual substitutability of that trip. So use those 4 criteria. You score the trip accordingly, and you can then classify the trip in terms of its value.
Great. Question 3, and I think this will also go to you, Scott. Do you have examples or analysis for business class on a 7-day advance versus 14-day advance, etc.?
The shopping that I did to prepare for this was all done on 10-day advance. But I can predict what the outcome will be. You'll almost always find that a business class fare, either at 7-day or 10 or 14-day advance, is going to have a lower carbon intensity than the equivalent economy class. Not always. And that's why you want to watch carbon intensity and not the cabin.
Great, thank you. The next question, and I'll maybe answer and then also ask others to chime in, which is, what are some examples of companies who are really doing business travel decarbonization well? What I would say is, I see there are a number of organizations doing it well. There's a number who have actually not only doing it well, but actually publishing and talking about it. One of the best examples that I'd see that I'd encourage everyone to look at is Boston Consulting Group's recent sustainability report. Not only are they doing it very well, they actually document in a pretty detailed manner the strategy, tools, tactics, and execution models that they use to achieve their results. And I think we'll also see that we'll be publishing a number of additional case studies over the coming months with other examples, but they're a great one that has published that you can go take it and download it today. Scott or Joel, I don't know if you'd add anything.
I'll highlight the good work that Ernst & Young EY has done, particularly with their effort to ensure that a trip justifies the carbon that's necessary to execute the trip. So I think they're a leading example of using a pre-trip assessment in a really thoughtful way.
Great. Joel, anything you'd add?
No, I think you guys have covered it, and there are examples through the research that I could share, but due to our commitment to anonymity, I won't go there. Thanks.
Terrific. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more. So I'll start this with Scott, but Joel would love to add this, which is, what is your perspective on switching airlines as part of the strategy to think about decarbonization and carbon intensity?
Sure. The cold-hearted answer is take the airline that has the lowest carbon intensity that you can possibly afford. The better, probably longer-term answer is look at the airline at the airline level, look at its carbon intensity and the rate at which it is reducing it over time. So if you do that, and we've got I can share a link in the follow-up. We've done the analysis. It turns out that the airline, well, let me not make a commercial for the airline. Read the paper and you'll see which airline is the best at managing its carbon temperature, which is the product of carbon intensity and absolute emissions over time.
Yeah, Scott, I love that concept of carbon temperature. I think it's so fascinating. And I guess I would just add here, maybe give some consideration to where you sense the airline is going. It's one thing to do a today snapshot, but I would also just consider to what extent are they either investing in or exploring new forms of mobility, whether EV tolls, et cetera. And also, to what extent are they being creative about helping when is the right time to maybe do some mode switching to rail. And so I would really be, if I were in your shoes, I would do some thinking about, are they showing creativity about how might we help our clients in this important area? And it may be more than just a today snapshot.
Great. So given the time, I'll make this the last question and then hand it over to Kelly to close us out. And the question is, how we think about for increasing flight prices through an internal CO2 price? Would this help increase ROI? You keep this fee within the company, and then you can use it for scope 1 or 2 investments, et cetera. But the concept being, if you added an internal price for CO2, that would then increase the cost of the flight and then help increase the ROI using your approach.
Yeah. So that's essentially a carbon tax, and it will do a couple of things. It will raise the price, which will help weed out some low-value trips. So that's good. And those funds can be used for, funding initiatives like purchases of SAF. So that's also good. But raising the price using an internal tax does nothing for the traveler. It doesn't allow you to buy a higher quality trip, which negates the opportunity to have, less traveler friction and frankly, a more successful trip. And it's counterproductive because it gets people to try to choose the lowest carbon oriented flight they can find, which is typically in the economy cabin, which I hope I've made the point is the worst cabin to be in from an overall climate perspective. So I'm not a fan of that approach.
Great. Well, with that, let me turn it back over to Kelly to close it out.
Thank you guys so much. That was incredible. So much to think about. And I would also like to thank everybody who attended today. I hope you enjoyed your time. Again, please don't hesitate to take us up on the offer, as well as reach out to us with any follow-up questions that you have. We will be sending out this recording to everyone within 72 hours. So keep an eye out for that email. And that is all. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.